Hello, my name is Brandy Stark. I have a rather unique history in this area. I am the founder of the Spirits of St. Petersburg. I actually started doing paranormal investigation in 1997 before it became popular. I wrote my first article in 1999 and formalized the team with the name in 2000. We have been investigating ever since. In addition to that, I'm a local area artist, award-winning, and I have hand-wrapped wire metal sculpture, photography, upcycle, and polymer clay as my four major genres. In addition to that, I am an academic, so I have a rather unique role. I have 3 master's degrees and a PhD. 2 of the master's degrees I actually focused on the liminal state. So one was religious studies, and I focused on the role of ghosts in Greco-Roman pagan society. The last one that I just did was liberal studies, and I focused on the dance macabre as a form of proto-feminism. But I did get to study revenants and liminal state beings. In addition to that, I teach religious studies, humanities, and liberal studies. I am the host of Paranormal Pets on Pet Life Radio. I have a grumble of pugs who you probably hear in the background because they are never quiet when I'm trying to do something. And I actually started and founded the Paranormal Pugs page, I believe in 2002. It's a pretty old website, starting to gather and starting to study a subgenre of pets and the paranormal. I also have a shadow animals page. So, phenomena. I believe I met Jack Kerouac at Haslam's. I was finishing up an investigation with the spirits. I had an elf meter because that was the least costly meter, and I could not afford much back in the day. I was a graduate student. And I had a film camera. Even though digital cameras were coming out, I could not afford one, so I had a 400 speed black and white Canon, which I actually still have. My meter started to register over a stack of books. They had turned off the power. I really couldn't figure out why it was beginning to spike and light up. So I took a picture of books, because that's what you did. It was ironically the art section, so that was pretty cool. I took the film to Eckerd Pharmacy, or Eckerd Pharmaceutical, Eckerd Drugs back in the day. Taken 5 shots of this wall where this was going on. The first and second didn't have anything. The fourth and fifth didn't have anything, but the middle shot had a beautiful mist going right across the top. Nobody was smoking. I have no explanation for this. I did find out years later that an employee who was shelving books there after the store was closed felt somebody walk up behind him, say, "Hey, how you doing?" He turned around to say, "We are closed. What are you doing in here?" And there was nobody there. And it was in the same area where I had my experience. Jack Kerouac is alleged to haunt the store. He did live in St. Petersburg. Haslam sold his books. It's a very old independent bookstore that is owned by the 3rd or 4th generation now of this family. And he used to go into the store and find his books and reshelf them because they would sell better at eye level, even though Haslam's always put everything by alphabetical last name of the author. So after he died, the story was that books started moving on their own. So I do think Jack Kerouac is probably there. If not him, somebody is, but we really entertained whoever that was. I did get to meet Fink Foster, the projectionist at Tampa Theater. I was actually with my little elf meter again. This was very early in the spirit's career. I was standing in a doorway, and all of a sudden the meter went off, and I got very excited, and my house inspector co-teammates came up, and they were like, "Oh no, it's probably just unshielded wiring." I was very disappointed, started to walk away. The meter started going off like crazy. I felt this on my shoulder, and it got warm. There was actually a 7-degree temperature spike in that area. And all of the equipment began to go crazy, mine and everybody else's. It turns out the doorway that I was in was the former entranceway to the manager's office, where Fink would have been. I have seen a person pushed by an entity, which was pretty eerie. That person did one investigation and then never came back. I have seen lights turn on and off by themselves. We have been in a room full of equipment that was both battery operated and plugged into power sources. I asked the question, did you commit suicide while we were doing an EVP session? And every piece of equipment, plugged in or battery operated, shut off at once. Turns out that there was a family relative that the family had called us in to see if they were haunting the place. and they had committed suicide. But they were very connected to a Catholic faith where this is a pretty big sin. And apparently a very, very sensitive topic. I have seen animals act up. I saw one shadow animal once, which is interesting because I don't classify myself as a psychic. But the most interactive entities that I've ever dealt with, ironically, are family. And what I find really interesting is that the most commonly reported story that I get is family. Typically parents or grandparents, but usually close family. I am an only child. My father was an only child, and each of his parents were only children. On my mother's side, she was one of two. She had a brother. But my family is remarkably small, and I'm the end of the line. So it seems like when my family passes over, they come to let us know. The first experience I had was in the early 2000s. My grandmother had passed away after I graduated. And I had been waiting and studying ghosts for years at that point. And I had visited her that day. I knew that she was dying, but I thought she probably had another week. I thought I'd see her again. I had come home. My car was in the shop. When you're poor, that's a big deal. My major transportation, and it was a big deal at that point because it was a big repair. I also had an art show coming up, and I was just very unsettled and very agitated. And I finally got myself in bed and asleep, and I think I fell asleep around 11 o'clock. Right around 1 o'clock in the morning, I was awakened by an aroma. And you have to understand that I have pretty severe allergies, so there are no aromatic devices. It was, I believe, October. So it was cool enough in Florida at that time that the windows were shut and the AC was off. And I have no accounting for this aroma because it wasn't there when I went to sleep. And it was so strong that it woke me up. I had a vision of blue-white light, and I opened my eyes with this aroma that I called ambrosia. It smelled like chocolate and ginger snaps and orange blossoms. I mean, it's very, very hard to describe, but it was beautiful. And I knew three things. I knew that she had died. I knew that she was okay. And I knew to look at the time. And the next morning when my mother came out, and my mother is a skeptic when it comes to ghosts, I had already known she passed. It turned out that my grandmother had died while my mother had been coming home from a visit with her. And this was back in the day when you had voicemail, essentially, on home phones, not answering machines, but voicemail. And the hospital had called her, and she did not get the call. They had gotten a hold of another family member, but the voicemail did not trigger through until the next morning. So I thought that was interesting. The second family member to show up was actually my mother's brother. The family was estranged. He had passed away and nobody told us. I had two of the spirit sensitives meet me at my mother's house, which was not uncommon because I would have the location, and in order to keep people from studying or researching it, they would meet me, and I would drive us. And these two women came in, and one was going through early menopause, and she was starting to get really warm, and my mother kept the house in the 80s because air conditioning was expensive. So she started to tell me that she was hot, and I remember reaching up to turn on a fan. And my hand was right beneath the cord. I had not touched it, hadn't pulled on it, because it was one of those you had to pull on. And the fan turned on. And I realized it was a practical joke. And the other woman who was there was a very strong sensitive, and she started to describe a man with kind of a big, bushy, red-brown beard, but she got the name wrong. It was a common name, but she called out a different common name. So I didn't think much of it. I thought, oh, my mother's going to be thrilled as a skeptic that she's got a ghost in the house. But she knew that this person was related to Mom. We did the investigation. I came home, and this was when the internet was new, but I was literally typing my report, and all of a sudden I had to stop, and I had to look up my uncle's name. And I can't explain it. I mean, I was literally in the middle of a sentence about this investigation, and I was very adamant that we finish recording what happened. And I stopped, and I looked up his name, and I found an obscure newspaper that had his obituary. And I remember I had to wait. I didn't want to tell my mother this over the phone. I had to wait for her to come home, and I told her. And that's how we found out. The third entity actually left me some things, which I thought was pretty cool. My father was an engineer. He was very much an engineer personality. I am half engineer, and half my personality definitely comes from him. He unfortunately developed lymphoma and passed away in 2012 of cancer. He died in St. Louis. I was in Florida at the time because I was working. I'm a professor, and it was really late in the semester, and I guess I didn't think he would pass that soon. I actually had planned to go up again. You can tell I'm not psychic because I would know better, and I would have just gone. But he passed away, and for the next 6 months, some unusual things happened. The first thing was when my mother was sitting in this room with me, and we were talking about Dad, and it was early after he passed, and I noted that Mom liked Perry Mason, and Perry Mason was an old Pulp Fiction that they turned into a TV show and then some movies, and that Dad loved The Shadow, and The Shadow was a Pulp Fiction that they turned into a radio show. Well, as a humanities interest, I was in love with The Shadow. I love these things from the 30s. So I talked about how our family actually had that in common because my parents were divorced, and they were almost polar opposites: conservative, liberal, Democrat, Republican, cat, dog, introvert, extrovert, complete opposites. They were both very intelligent. My parents actually met at Ohio State doing their graduate degrees in the 60s. So as we're talking about this, don't laugh, I have a Shadow action figure from the 1994 movie release. That's how much I love The Shadow. And it has been sitting on my shelf. And this thing actually kind of did this off the shelf, hit the floor. Now you have to understand, my mother's a skeptic, I'm a paranormalist. There's no traffic outside. I have a one-story house. There were no vibrations. The pugs were lying on the floor and not moving. They weren't running around. This thing had been on my shelf about a year. It has been on my shelf ever since that point. It has never fallen. Never. It fell at the exact moment that I said the three of us had something in common as a family, and that we all loved Pulp Fiction. And I think that was my dad's way of saying, hey, I'm right here. The second thing that happened, however, I find really undisputable, and I actually still have this. This is a Monopoly car. I inherited his Saturn. My dad was very loyal to Saturns. I do not have the same taste in cars, but I have a Miata, and she's a 1996 with no air conditioning in Florida. And it's very hot when you have to go to the classroom pouring down sweat because you drove there. So I inherited his car. I had gotten it, and it was right around the time of the recall because they had a faulty unit in the steering wheel, and I wasn't driving it, and I had tried everything with Saturn to get a part so that I could drive this car because it had air conditioning. And they put me off, and I was really ticked, and one day they sent a letter saying, oh, hi, we're Saturn. We know you have a car that has a defective part and is on recall, and here are all the things that you can do. And it was this chipper little letter, and I remember I called up my mother because she was at work. I live actually next door in my own house, but I called her up and I said, I cannot believe that they did this, and they sent this to me, and I have done all of these things, and I was just railing on this. I can't believe it, blah, blah. I set the letter down on my kitchen counter. There are no shelves above the kitchen counter. It was in the middle of an open space. I live alone. My doors were locked. I have pugs in the house, but they are not prehensile. They can't do anything. All of a sudden behind me I heard this little, just like that. And I'm on the phone with her. I had turned around to go and get something out of the pantry. And she heard me stop and she said, what's wrong? And I turned around, and here is this Monopoly car on the letter. Gray, metal, ghost love metal. So I told her what happened, and I remember she said, are you sure you were home alone? I have been home for an hour. There was no one else in the house. There is no way somebody could do that and run. I'm in the middle of something where I can see very clearly. There's no hallway. There's nowhere to go. So I got off the phone, I went out to the garage, I found my Monopoly game, which is 20 years old, maybe older, might be 30 actually at this point. I think my parents had played it at one point. It was in the garage, under boxes, sealed shut from humidity. I had to pull everything off, pull it out, open the box. I looked through the contents. This car was missing. I have no earthly explanation. There's no way that I can account for this. The last little thing that I found from my father is that we are descended from Meriwether Lewis of the Lewis and Clark expedition. This he actually did when I was totally alone. Mom and I had gone grocery shopping. I was unpacking the groceries, and all of a sudden I heard this little, same deal, but it was a sliding sound. It kind of slid down, and kind of like that, from my refrigerator. And I turned around, and behind and underneath one of the drawers in the refrigerator, like the crisper, was a bright and shiny, this is dulled over time, but this is actually it, Sacagawea silver dollar. I think my father was very proud of his heritage. We're descended from John Marshall. We're related to kings. We were bodyguards to King James I. That's not a ghost, that's a pug, sorry. Unless that's you, Dad, please don't do that. But this coin, I think, was his way of telling me, always be proud of being a star. So I've kept them. I have no explanation for them. Somebody asked if my mother was playing a prank on me. She wasn't in the house. She was next door. And my mother does not have that sense of humor, let me assure you. So there are my stories. If they're of interest, let me know. And hopefully this will upload to YouTube.